The history of the rocket begins long before modern science or space travel and is rooted in ancient human experimentation with fire chemicals and controlled energy because the rocket was not invented suddenly by one person but emerged gradually from collective discovery, and the earliest stage of this development occurred in China, where philosophical curiosity, practical craftsmanship, and military necessity intersected over many centuries to produce transformative technologies, most importantly gunpowder, without which rockets could not exist, and Chinese alchemists during the Tang dynasty, while seeking medicines and immortality, accidentally discovered that mixtures of sulfur, charcoal, and saltpeter produced powerful reactions, and although early texts warned of danger, experimentation continued, leading to refined formulas and deliberate uses, first for ritual fireworks and celebrations intended to frighten spirits and symbolize cosmic harmony, and later for weapons as Chinese states faced repeated warfare and invasion, and as gunpowder weapons evolved from simple firecrackers into fire lances and bombs, engineers realized that explosive force could be directed rather than merely released, and this realization led to the crucial idea that burning gases confined in a tube open at one end could generate forward motion, creating thrust, and this principle, though simple, marked one of the most important conceptual breakthroughs in technological history because it defined rocket propulsion. And by the time of the Song dynasty, Chinese military workshops had institutionalized weapons research, allowing innovations to be tested, recorded, and reproduced, and during the 13th century these processes produced the first true rockets, commonly known as fire arrows, which were arrows fitted with gunpowder-filled tubes that ignited after launch and propelled themselves independently, increasing range, speed, noise, and fear, and historical records describe their use in battles against Mongol forces, confirming their operational reality rather than legendary status, and these devices represent the earliest rockets because they moved by self-generated thrust rather than external force, even though they lacked guidance or precision, and surviving manuals later described more complex designs, showing that experimentation rapidly expanded once the principle was proven, and these early rockets also reveal how invention is rarely isolated because the rocket emerged from shared knowledge, state support, and cumulative improvement rather than a single moment of genius, and this origin story establishes the foundation for later transmission across Asia and beyond, where traders, soldiers, and scholars carried techniques, materials, and ideas along networks of exchange, ensuring that rocket knowledge did not remain confined to one culture but became part of a broader human legacy of experimentation, adaptation, and problem-solving that would continue to evolve across centuries and civilizations. Through this process, the earliest Chinese invention began its long transformation, setting in motion developments that would eventually reshape warfare science and humanity's understanding of motion, energy, and possibility itself over time, as generations built upon inherited knowledge without fully knowing its distant beginnings, yet always guided by curiosity, necessity, and the drive to harness controlled power, as history slowly unfolded beyond its original context, shaping future paths of innovation. Globally, as rocket knowledge spread beyond its Chinese origins, it followed routes shaped by commerce, conflict, and curiosity, moving westward through Central Asia and into the Islamic world during the 13th century, a period marked by intense cultural exchange, facilitated by trade networks such as the Silk Road and by the movements of empires, including the Mongols, who absorbed and redistributed technologies wherever they traveled, and within Islamic societies, scholars and engineers quickly recognized the potential of gunpowder-based propulsion, incorporating rockets into military practice while also documenting their construction and use in technical manuscripts, and Arabic texts from this era describe rockets used for battlefield disruption, signaling, and siege warfare, demonstrating that the core principles developed in China were understood and adapted rather than merely copied, and this process of adaptation was essential because local materials, climates, and tactical needs required modification of designs, which in turn generated new experimentation and innovation, and as knowledge continued to diffuse westward, it eventually reached Europe, where it arrived in a social and technological environment undergoing its own transformation, and although European states rapidly embraced gunpowder for cannons and firearms, rockets initially remained peripheral because they were less accurate and harder to control, yet their dramatic visual effects ensured they were never completely ignored, appearing in festivals, demonstrations, and occasional military use, and for several centuries European engagement with rockets was intermittent and limited, constrained by incomplete chemical understanding and manufacturing inconsistency, yet the idea of self-propelled motion continued to intrigue inventors, philosophers, and scientists, particularly as the scientific revolution reshaped concepts of motion, force, and mechanics, and thinkers like Isaac Newton established laws that would later allow rocket behavior to be mathematically described, even if practical application lagged behind theory, and during this long interval rockets survived as experimental curiosities rather than dominant weapons, waiting for conditions that would allow further advancement, and those conditions emerged in the late 18th century through unexpected encounters with advanced non-European rocket systems, particularly in India, where the Kingdom of Mysore under rulers such as Hyder Ali and Tipu Sultan developed iron-cased rocket capable of higher pressure, greater range, and improved reliability, and these weapons shocked British forces during colonial conflicts, demonstrating that rocket technology had not stagnated globally but had evolved independently in response to regional needs, and British engineers carefully studied captured Mysorean rockets, recognizing that iron casings represented a crucial improvement over traditional paper or bamboo, and this knowledge directly influenced the work of Sir William Congreve, who in the early 19th century developed standardized military rockets for the British Army and Navy, and Congreve rockets were used extensively during the Napoleonic Wars and other conflicts, producing fierce spectacle and symbolic power even when tactical effectiveness remained inconsistent. And although these rockets marked the peak of military rocketry in the pre-industrial era, their limitations eventually became apparent as rifled artillery improved accuracy and destructive capacity, leading once again to a decline in rocket use on the battlefield. Yet this decline did not signal the end of rocketry, but rather a transition, because as military interest waned, scientific curiosity increased, and the rocket began to be reimagined not merely as a weapon but as a tool for exploration, experimentation, and understanding natural laws, setting the stage for a profound conceptual shift that would redefine the rocket's purpose in the modern world. This conceptual shift toward viewing the rocket as something more than a battlefield novelty gradually took shape as scientific thinking matured and industrial capacity expanded. And during the 19th and early 20th centuries, the rocket's ancient principle began to attract thinkers who were less interested in immediate military advantage and more concerned with the fundamental laws governing motion, energy, and the structure of the universe. And although these thinkers lived centuries after the first Chinese rockets were built, their work remained deeply connected to that original invention, because they were exploring the same basic question of how an object could move by expelling mass. And one of the most influential figures in this intellectual transition was Konstantin Tsiolkovsky, a Russian schoolteacher whose isolation from major scientific institutions did not prevent him from developing groundbreaking ideas about space travel. And through mathematical reasoning, he demonstrated that rockets could theoretically achieve the velocities required to escape Earth's gravity, introducing equations that formalized what ancient inventors had discovered empirically. And while Tsiolkovsky's work remained largely theoretical, it was essential because it provided scientific legitimacy to the rocket concept and transformed it from a historical curiosity into a viable subject of serious study. And at roughly the same time, practical experimentation began to accelerate in other parts of the world, particularly in the United States, where Robert H. Goddard combined physics, engineering, and persistence to test rocket designs in real conditions. And Goddard's work represents a direct continuation of the ancient tradition of experimentation, because like the early Chinese inventors, he relied heavily on trial and error, refining designs based on observation rather than complete theoretical certainty. And his successful launch of the first liquid-fueled rocket in 1926 marked a major step forward in efficiency, control, and scalability. Yet even this modern achievement depended on the same core principle first realized centuries earlier in China. And while Goddard faced public skepticism, his innovations quietly influenced later developments, especially in Europe, where interest in rocketry was growing among engineers and visionaries. And in Germany, figures such as Hermann Oberth inspired a generation of enthusiasts who saw rockets as vehicles for exploration rather than mere weapons. But as global politics darkened during the interwar period, rocket research became increasingly intertwined with military ambitions, culminating during World War II in the development of the V-2 rocket, which despite its destructive purpose demonstrated that rockets could reach unprecedented heights and velocities, becoming the first human-made objects to touch the edge of space. And this moment, although tragic in context, confirmed what the first rocket had implied centuries earlier. That self-propelled motion could transcend conventional limits, and after the war rocket technology entered a new phase shaped by both fear and ambition as rival powers invested heavily in propulsion systems. And although these developments appear far removed from the fire arrows of medieval China, they remain connected by an unbroken conceptual chain. Because every modern rocket still operates on the same fundamental principle discovered through early gunpowder experimentation. And this continuity reinforces the importance of understanding the first rocket not as an isolated artifact but as the foundation of an entire technological lineage. And by tracing this lineage carefully, one can see that the modern era did not invent rocketry from nothing but rather expanded and refined an idea that had existed for centuries. And this realization reframes the history of rocketry as a long human story rather than a sudden modern breakthrough, emphasizing that innovation often unfolds across generations, cultures, and civilizations. And as this story continues, it becomes increasingly clear that the original creation of the rocket in 13th century China represents one of humanity's most enduring technological contributions, shaping how people understood movement power and the possibility of reaching beyond ordinary boundaries. And this understanding sets the stage for examining more closely the social, cultural, and philosophical forces that allowed such an invention to emerge in the first place and ensured its survival through long periods of change and uncertainty. Examining those social, cultural, and philosophical forces reveals why the first rocket emerged where and when it did. Because medieval China possessed a unique combination of practical craftsmanship, state support, and intellectual tradition that encouraged experimentation with materials and processes, and Chinese society placed high value on recording technical knowledge through manuals, illustrations, and apprenticeships, ensuring that discoveries were not lost but refined over time. And this culture of preservation was critical to the survival and improvement of early rocket designs, because it allowed later generations to build upon earlier experiments rather than starting from scratch. And within military institutions, specialized workshops were established where artisans, engineers, and soldiers collaborated to test weapons under real conditions, creating a feedback loop between theory and practice that accelerated innovation. And the invention of the fire arrow was not a single, isolated experiment but the outcome of repeated trials, adjustments, and refinements carried out by many individuals whose names are largely unknown. And this anonymity reflects the collective nature of technological progress in pre-modern societies, where success was measured by effectiveness rather than authorship. And the early rockets produced during the Song dynasty were used strategically in coordinated volleys launched from frames or racks, demonstrating that inventors understood not only how to make rockets but how to integrate them into broader tactical systems. And this systems-based thinking further distinguishes early Chinese rocketry from mere experimentation, showing that it had reached a mature operational stage. And descriptions of rocket use emphasize their ability to create confusion, panic, and disruption rather than precise destruction, revealing an understanding of psychological warfare that complemented their physical impact. And the visual spectacle of fire, smoke, and sound amplified their effectiveness even when accuracy was limited. And this combination of physical and psychological force ensured that rockets remained attractive despite their imperfections. And as knowledge of these weapons spread beyond China, it carried with it not just technical details but also tactical concepts, influencing how other cultures viewed the role of rockets in warfare. And in the Islamic world, for example, rockets were incorporated into signaling systems as well as combat, reflecting an appreciation for their visibility and reach. And scholars documented their construction with careful attention to materials, proportions, and ignition methods, embedding rocket knowledge within a broader scientific tradition. And this documentation allowed rocket technology to persist even when political instability disrupted institutions, because texts could travel, survive, and be rediscovered. And as rockets entered Europe, their reception was shaped by different military priorities. Yet even when underused, their presence in festivals, fireworks, and demonstrations kept the idea of self-propulsion alive in public imagination, ensuring that the rocket was never entirely forgotten. And this persistence of the idea rather than the device itself was crucial because it allowed later innovators to rediscover and reinterpret rocket propulsion when scientific understanding advanced. And thus the early history of the rocket demonstrates how ideas can outlast their initial applications, surviving through cultural memory and sporadic practice until conditions allow them to flourish again. And this long survival underscores the importance of the original invention, because without that initial breakthrough there would have been no idea to revive. And the 13th century fire arrow therefore represents a decisive moment when humanity first crossed a conceptual boundary, discovering that motion could be generated internally rather than imposed from outside. And this discovery, quietly, reshaped future possibilities even as its full implications remained unrealized for centuries. This conceptual boundary once crossed could never truly be reversed. Because even when rocket technology faded temporarily from practical use, the knowledge that self-propulsion was possible remained embedded in human understanding. And as centuries passed, this knowledge interacted with changing political, economic, and scientific conditions, shaping how later societies interpreted and reused the original invention. And during the later medieval period and early modern era, the transmission of rocket knowledge continued primarily through warfare, trade, and scholarship rather than formal scientific institutions. And this mode of transmission meant that rocket designs were often altered to suit local needs while preserving their essential function. And in regions influenced by Islamic scholarship, rockets were analyzed alongside other mechanical devices and classified within broader engineering traditions, ensuring that they were not treated as anomalies but as legitimate tools governed by principles that could be studied and refined. And this intellectual framing helped stabilize rocket knowledge across generations, preventing it from being dismissed as superstition or novelty. And when European societies encountered rockets through both Islamic intermediaries and colonial conflicts, their response was shaped by existing military doctrines that prioritized accuracy and control. Yet, even when rockets were considered inferior to cannons, their unique qualities ensured continued experimentation, and European engineers attempted various stabilizing methods, including guide sticks, fins, and improved ignition systems, reflecting ongoing engagement with the fundamental problem of controlling self-propelled motion. And although these efforts produced mixed results, they contributed to a growing body of practical knowledge that would later be revisited. And this accumulation of partial solutions illustrates how technological progress often advances through imperfect steps rather than sudden mastery. And the rocket's long history of trial and error demonstrates that resilience and adaptability are as important as precision in the survival of an invention. And as global exploration expanded during the early modern period, rockets also became part of cultural exchange beyond warfare, appearing in celebrations, demonstrations, and symbolic displays that emphasized their dramatic qualities. And this cultural presence further embedded the rocket concept in public consciousness, making it familiar even when not widely used. And familiarity matters because technologies that remain visible are more likely to be reconsidered when circumstances change. And by the 18th century, such a change occurred when European powers encountered advanced rocket systems in South Asia, where independent development had produced innovations that addressed some of the limitations of earlier designs, particularly through the use of iron casings that allowed higher internal pressure and greater thrust. And the effectiveness of these Mysorean rockets challenged European assumptions and forced renewed attention to rocketry as a serious military technology. And the subsequent development of standardized rockets by British engineers demonstrates how cross-cultural encounters can revitalize dormant technologies. And yet even this revival did not fully realize the rocket's potential, because its true significance lay beyond the battlefield. And as scientific understanding deepened during the Enlightenment and industrial eras, thinkers began to reconsider the rocket in light of new theories of motion, energy, and mechanics, recognizing that what ancient inventors had achieved empirically could now be analyzed mathematically. And this realization marked another turning point in the long history of the first rocket, shifting focus from immediate utility to underlying principle. And this shift would eventually open pathways that extended far beyond the original context of medieval warfare. This renewed focus on underlying principle rather than immediate application gradually transformed how the rocket was perceived by scholars and experimenters. Because once attention shifted from battlefield effectiveness to fundamental mechanics, the rocket became a subject of curiosity about motion itself. And this curiosity was nurtured by broader changes in scientific thought that emphasized observation, measurement, and repeatable experimentation. And although the earliest rocket makers had relied almost entirely on empirical methods, later thinkers sought to explain why rockets worked using mathematical reasoning. And this effort to connect practice with theory helped preserve the rocket's relevance during periods when it was no longer dominant as a weapon. And throughout the 18th and 19th centuries, rockets occupied an ambiguous position between science, spectacle, and military utility, appearing in fireworks displays, public demonstrations, and experimental trials that kept the concept alive even as practical applications remained limited. And this ambiguity allowed the rocket to bridge cultural domains, belonging simultaneously to artisans, soldiers, scientists, and entertainers. And this wide cultural footprint increased its resilience because it could survive shifts in any one domain. And as industrialization progressed, new materials, manufacturing techniques, and energy sources became available, providing tools that could finally address some of the long-standing limitations of rocket design, such as inconsistent thrust, instability, and limited range. And innovators began to revisit ancient principles with modern resources, discovering that the same basic idea could produce far greater results when paired with improved engineering. And this rediscovery highlights the importance of historical continuity, because without knowledge of earlier rockets, later innovators might never have considered propulsion by expelled mass as a viable path, and thus the first rocket continued to exert influence long after its initial context had disappeared, shaping the direction of technological exploration even when it was not explicitly acknowledged. And this influence became more visible at the turn of the 20th century when individuals inspired by both scientific progress and imaginative literature began to seriously consider space travel. And these individuals did not invent rocketry anew but instead extended an existing lineage, refining propulsion methods, materials, and control systems while remaining fundamentally connected to the ancient discovery that motion could be self-generated. And this continuity reinforces the idea that technological revolutions are often evolutionary rather than revolutionary, unfolding through the gradual accumulation of insight across generations. And the rocket's journey from medieval fire arrow to modern vehicle exemplifies this pattern clearly, because each stage built upon previous knowledge while adapting to new contexts and goals. And understanding this journey provides a deeper appreciation for the first rocket as a foundational invention whose significance lies not only in what it achieved immediately but in what it made possible over the long term. And as the narrative continues, it becomes increasingly clear that the rocket's enduring value stems from its ability to inspire reimagining, because every era that encountered it found new meanings and applications within its simple yet powerful principle, ensuring that the original invention continued to resonate across time and culture. This capacity for reimagining ensured that the rocket remained relevant even as its forms and functions evolved. And by the early 20th century, the accumulated weight of historical experience, theoretical insight, and practical experimentation converged to create conditions in which the rocket could finally move beyond its ancient limitations. And although this stage is often described as the birth of modern rocketry, it is more accurately understood as the maturation of a concept first realized centuries earlier. And pioneers such as Konstantin Tsiolkovsky, Robert Goddard, and Hermann Oberth did not invent the rocket in principle but clarified, expanded, and optimized it, translating an empirical medieval discovery into a scientifically grounded technology. And this translation process illustrates how the same idea can exist simultaneously at different levels of understanding across time, with early inventors knowing how to make rockets work and later scientists explaining why they worked and how they could be improved. And this layered knowledge structure is characteristic of many major technologies, yet the rocket stands out because its core principle remained so clearly identifiable across eras. And when liquid propellants, guidance systems, and staging were introduced, they did not replace the original idea but refined it, allowing the same fundamental mechanism to operate on a vastly larger scale. And even as rockets reached the edge of space during the mid-20th century, they remained conceptually linked to the fire arrows of 13th century China, because both relied on the same basic action of expelling mass to generate motion. And recognizing this continuity helps demystify modern rocketry by grounding it in a long human tradition of experimentation. And it also restores credit to early innovators whose contributions are often overshadowed by later achievements. And by situating modern developments within this broader historical arc, one can see that technological progress is cumulative rather than abrupt, advancing through the steady refinement of ideas that persist because they solve fundamental problems. And the problem solved by the first rocket was how to move independently of external forces, a problem that remains central to propulsion technology today. And the solution discovered by medieval Chinese inventors proved so robust that it could be scaled, adapted, and reinterpreted across cultures and centuries. And this robustness explains why the rocket ultimately became the foundation of space exploration, because it addressed a universal physical challenge in a way that no alternative technology could match. And although the social, political, and ethical contexts of rocket use have changed dramatically since its invention, the underlying concept remains unchanged, demonstrating the enduring power of simple ideas when they align with natural laws. And as the story continues toward its conclusion, it becomes evident that understanding the first rocket is essential not only for historical accuracy but for appreciating how human ingenuity unfolds over time, revealing patterns of discovery, transmission, and transformation that extend far beyond rocketry itself.